All right, so here we go. Let's talk about James Madison. Let's talk about the War of 1812. Let's get into it. So, we're going to explain how and why foreign policy changed under President Madison in the War of 1812. So, through explaining the War of 1812, we're going to talk about how the foreign policy changed. So, keep that in mind. So, did you think there was a way for the Federalist Party to survive? Keep that in mind. Spoiler alert, they're going to die after this. So, let's get into it. Key point one, very short key point, only thing we're going to talk about for Madison right now is to set up who he was. So, James Madison is the fourth president of the United States. Madison inherited the foreign conflicts of the presidents before him, but he also had new domestic issues. And we will talk about that in a bit. So if you need time, get that down again. Go ahead and pause it. His presidential terms, write these down, were 1809 to 1817. So he served from 1809 to 1817. Again, he served from 1809 to 1817. Okay, so let's get into key point two. Now, the War of 1812 is a fully armed conflict between Britain and the United States. There are many causes, both domestic and foreign, and it was America's first declared war. It was the first war declared by the U.S. Guess what? It was declared in 1812. All right, so the war went from 1812 to 1814. The war lasted from 1812 to 1814. Kinda. We're going to get into why in a bit. So let's first go over some of the causes. So, first cause, impressment. Yes, the British are still impressing American sailors. What is impressing? It's not when they show them cool stuff. It is when they capture American sailors and force them to serve on British vessels. Now, the British have their reasons for doing these that we've talked about, right? Sometimes the British say, hey, well, that's really a British guy deserting, whatever. But the point is, it's still happening. It is still happening. We've spent plenty of time talking about it. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it's still happening. It's still bothering Americans. The Napoleonic Wars, because again, Americans or historians, I should say, are really great at naming stuff, are still raging in Europe. Europe's at war. Everybody's on edge. Britain and France are economic opportunities the U.S. can't ignore. Basically, they're spending money like crazy. They're buying stuff like crazy, and America's trying to sell to them. Through all of this, the Orders in Council comes up, and those are policies put in place by Britain, and it prevents any ship from trading with their enemies. It's like a blockade over France, essentially. This includes neutral American ships, ignoring, or to some people, disrespecting America's neutrality. Because again, I told you about this once, but I'll mention it again. The U.S. has this pesky idea, though the rest of the world sees it as pesky, where they think that because they say, hey, we're neutral, we're not going to pick a fight, they can trade with enemies and allies and anybody they want on either side of the conflict without facing repercussions. Now, whether or not you agree with that, it's what Americans do and it's how they act, and other countries, especially Britain, does not like that, and they're not going to be okay with it. So those are some things that the British are doing. These are foreign issues. Now let's talk about a domestic one. So, all this new territory that the Louisiana Purchase, right, all these previously unbothered natives in the Ohio Valley and in the Great Lakes area, you're going to get some conflict, all right? And it'll come in the form of a military genius. I would consider him a genius. I'd consider him a really good military leader, known as Tecumseh. That is his name, Tecumseh. And he was a Shawnee leader, and he unites tribes in the Ohio Valley against American invaders, right? And I use invaders in quotes because, yes, they're settlers. Yes, they're Americans trying to settle and do all that stuff. Doesn't mean they're not invading native land, right? To the native, this is an invasion. To the Indian, this is an invasion. And he fights for Indian heritage in a time where so many others are beginning to assimilate. So in the East, again, this isn't like the Indian Wars of the 1860s and in Texas and in places like that where Plains Indians are going to fight for 100 years. In the East, a lot of the tribes assimilate. You get the 5 civilized tribes, which we're going to talk about later when we talk about Jackson. But you get these tribes that are, I don't want to say they're okay with this, but there are certain sects of them, certain groups that are kind of okay with it, and they want to become farmers, and some will become slaveholders, and the Cherokee will do a lot of this stuff, and a lot of other. They get their reservations, they get their land, and they want to maintain it. They want to act like the Americans, so to speak, dress and act like them and farm like them, in order to maintain their own nation and change, right? And Tecumseh very against this. Him and his brother. His brother was more of the speaker. He was more of the warrior. And they will fight against this. And there's a point where you could consider maybe they're going to win. But there's a few reasons why they don't. The War of 1812 is going to start. He's going to pick the British. His tribe, by the way, the Shawnee, picked the British again initially, and that didn't go well for them in the American Revolution. And I have this quote from him because I think it sums up why he fights really well. And it's just his vehement and, honorable disagreement with how Europeans and Americans saw the world, right? Sell a country. Why not sell the air or the great sea as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children? Right? The very concept annoys him. He in this thing that he writes, he goes off to say like, how could you trust whites? They killed Jesus Christ the minute he showed up. Like, he's a very smart guy. He's no speaker, but he's a warrior, and he's smart, and he knows. He can see the hypocrisy in some of this stuff, and his culture's beliefs, right? Native beliefs, like the idea of owning land is a ridiculous idea, and it's absurd to them, and it's so absurd that he's gonna try to fight against it. Whereas some other natives of the time are, well, okay, well, they're gonna give us this land, it's gonna be ours. Like, the concept of owning land is something they're gonna kind of not necessarily be okay with, but start to live with. And so part of why he fights is he refuses. And here's just kind of a map of what some of the conflicts look like. Prophetstown is where his brother kind of stays in Prophets, and he goes out and fights. And he's going to go into the Canada areas and fight later. This is just an idea of what it's fighting, where everybody was pre-War of 1812. The War of 1812 is going to change all of this. Another domestic/foreign issue is going to be the actions that the British are going to take are going to really, really bother the Americans. They're not going to be happy. They're going to shift foreign opinion and public opinion in more ways than just one, right? It's not just going to be a few that are angry about impressment. It's going to be everybody. And on top of that, there's a very famous incident called the Chesapeake Leopard Affair, where a British vessel, the Leopard, tracked and attacked an American vessel, the Chesapeake. It doesn't sink the vessel, but they attack it, they capture people, they impress a bunch of sailors, they do all this stuff. And this occurs right off the coast of Virginia in 1807. It's a big blow. It's a big problem. A lot of people are like, what? How can you let this happen? Why is this happening? Jefferson, what are you going to do about it? Nothing gets done about it. And then on top of that, and now we can't confirm if this is true. Some of it probably is true and some of it probably isn't. But and this cartoon kind of shows that there's a narrative going around out there that the British are actively supplying the natives like Tecumseh that are fighting American expansion. That these natives are fighting with British-made weapons and British supplies, and the British are encouraging them through Canada, right? Because, again, the British are still in Canada. Now, Americans love conspiracies, right? We love them now. We loved them especially then. And hearing this, a lot of people get really angry, and they start to buy into it. And I would say that it is, some of it's true and some of it isn't. Because there's definitely some of that going around out there. Tecumseh and all them, like, pestering the Americans is, the British are definitely okay with it. And now we're going to get into a domestic issue that is another huge reason why we go to war. And those are the war hawks. And I don't mean literal war hawks, even though it's a sweet picture of a sweet war hawk. I'm talking about people in Congress who are big fans of war. A member of Congress who's a big fan of war and whose first instinct is like, hey, we should go to war. Right, like, hey, the French said some rude stuff. Should we go to war? Like, that's a war hawk. And they're, like, kicking and screaming and throwing tantrums all over Congress because of all of these different actions by the British that we talked about, right? They are furious. And every other step that the British take is another, like, bullet in the war hawk's gun of, like, why are we going to war? And so some of these key war hawks, like Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and a guy named Felix Grundy, will be like, they're going to stoke the flame. Like, it's going to be a little flame. They're going to make it worse by just saying, like, why are we going to war? This is an insult to America, right? That term that I put in quotes about the impressment of, like, this is an insult to American independence or American neutrality, I should say. They're going to keep saying stuff like that. This is an insult. You're insulting America. You're insulting our honor. And they're going to rile everybody up. And it's going to lead to war. There will be a war that breaks out in 1812. So let's talk about the course of the War of 1812. So, Initially, fighting starts in the northwest Great Lakes area by Detroit, like in Michigan, and what would be Michigan. Americans are going to try to invade through there. It's not going to work. The Canadians are going to push them back. There's even a funny like narrative out there where the Americans think that the Canadians are going to like rise up and join them, and that doesn't. The Canadians want to stay right where they're at with who they're with. So that doesn't happen. Now, the Battle of Lake Erie, the Battle of Thames. In the Battle of the Thames, Tecumseh will die, by the way. He'll be killed by the American forces. So, that's part of why I say the War of 1812 messes with Tecumseh's stuff. When he joins and starts fighting with the British for the British, he ends up losing and dying. So it doesn't go great for him. Now, the British are going to do what the British do when they fight this war, because this is how they fought every war, and it's part of why they won a lot of them. They will open up another theater of this conflict. So the fighting's going on in Canada. The British are going to send a fleet. They're going to blockade the Atlantic and keep the U.S. from leaving, which is what they're really good at. Again, greatest navy in the world. And they will start a southern campaign, the Chesapeake campaign. And before I get to that, let's talk about some of the fighting. There will be a U.S. vessel that will it's the USS Constitution. It's a frigate. It will defeat I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name, but a British warship. And British warships were bigger and better than American ones. They just were. Again, greatest navy in the world. And there'll be a story about cannons like literally bouncing off of this vessel. And it'll get the nickname Old Ironsides. And that is a picture of Old Ironsides, because Old Ironsides is still in commission in the U.S. Navy. It was that famous. People felt really like they really loved that ship. So it's still around. You can still, I think it's in Philadelphia. You can still find pictures of it. That's a real picture of the actual Old Ironsides. That is the boat that cannonballs bounced off of. So let's talk about the Chesapeake campaign, where the British just, wreaked havoc in the South, burned down the White House. And there's a battle in Baltimore. They burn down the White House, and then there's a theater in the South, Battle of Horseshoe Bend, where Jackson is there and he gets natives to fight against each other, gets a victory. The course of this war is a whole lot of nothing, and the reason I say that is because, sure, the White House gets burned down, but the president is safe. Madison escapes. He saves the original portrait of Washington, or his wife does. There is no decisive blow. There is no decisive victory. Sure, the White House burning looks really bad. Sure, a tiny American warship blowing up a British one looks bad. Sure, the death of Tecumseh is bad. Sure, losing Detroit is bad. Yes, there was conflict. Yes, there was death. It was war. But nothing happens. Nothing gets accomplished. Nothing gets solved. No one gets beaten, essentially. And by 1814, everybody's kind of like, why are we fighting? Like, we would rather be trading and making money instead. And so they're going to sign a treaty and end the war. But a few weeks after the war is officially ended, there will be another battle. It'll be called the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. The reason there's a battle is because, yes, the war's over, but no one told Jackson and no one told the British officer in charge because, there's no phones. There's no way to communicate that. 1815 problems. So this battle takes place after the war is over, but it is a heroic, historic victory. It is the victory that will make Jackson a star. It'll make him famous. His army is outnumbered 2-1. I believe the numbers, if I'm not mistaken, he loses like 71 people, and he kills like 2,000 British soldiers at this battle. And it makes him famous. It makes him a rock star. So just keep that. It makes Jackson famous. So the Battle of New Orleans will make Andrew Jackson famous, and that's going to matter in a little bit. So let's talk about the effects of the conflict. So the outcomes. Treaty of Ghent, signed in 1814, officially ends the conflict. So the conflict went from 1812 to 1814. Again, nobody wins. There's no land changing hands. It's a draw. It's essentially a draw. But Americans feel victorious, and part of why they feel victorious is that last memory of that fight is a big, big, big victory. Like the biggest victory of the whole war at the Battle of New Orleans, and it was the last thing that Americans remember. So Americans feel like they won this war. Now, something to consider and keep in mind. Well, you know what? No, let's talk about that on the next one. So just no one wins this war. In a way, this war is like the American Revolution Part 2, but again, we'll talk about it on the next slide, so I don't want to get too far ahead. So some effects. People feel a swell of national pride. They feel proud to be Americans, right? I'm proud to be an American. That starts here. Now, the North begins to manufacture all sorts of goods that they needed. So this was already happening, but it's going to increase because when they're blockaded and fighting war with Britain, the people who they got their stuff from, now there's no stuff, right? Now nothing's coming. If you thought nothing was coming before, definitely nothing's coming now. And so manufacturing is going to take a boom. If it was already on the rise, it explodes on the rise and it just keeps going. The Federalist Party is going to go away and die. And we'll talk about why on the last slide. The U.S. becomes respected as a power. Forever U.S. What does that mean? Well, this conflict makes the United States a regular player in the game. They're no longer a baby country. Now they're like a teenage country, right? They're regular. They can go to the table. They can sit at the grown-up table with the other countries and participate. And that is a huge, that's what I was talking about on the other slide, right? That is a big deal for the United States. They can trade like everybody else. They're respected like everybody else. When the United States says something, it has a different weight to it now. It'd be like if a little kid was, and I mean like a 5-year-old kid was like, I'm going to beat you up. That doesn't mean as much compared to, say, a 25-year-old adult when that's taller than you. It's like, I'm going to beat you up, right? Or that is as tall as you. Like, they have different weights. They mean different things. And the U.S. has now become something that is, when they say like, hey, take us seriously, other countries are going to take them seriously now. So just keep that in mind. And now let's talk about the death of the Federalists with the Hartford Convention. So the Hartford Convention was a meeting in Hartford, Connecticut, where all the Federalists got together to discuss their policies. They wanted economic assistance for New England. They wanted a 2/3 congressional majority for embargoes for state admission and declaring war. So instead of just a regular majority, they wanted a 2/3 congressional majority. They wanted to rescind the 3/5 compromise, like getting rid of that, which would have been a good thing. They wanted one-term presidents instead of 2, and no state successors, or same state successors, meaning that a president couldn't be from the same state, or like 2 from Virginia, like Jefferson and Madison. They talked of secession. Some of the radical Federalists were talking about secession. So it's basically just a political meeting, the Hartford Convention. The problem is, after the War of 1812, this information gets out, and these people are seen as anti-American. Right? They're an anti-American party. How dare you Federalists talk about like this stuff when we're at war and we're winning and we're doing awesome, even though they didn't really win. So they're perceived as traitors, and this weakens the party. Like, they're no longer a national party. The people on the outside that don't like them, or that maybe like them, now don't. And this kills the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party will not survive this. They will not make it out of 1814 alive. So that is it for me. Make sure you get your exit ticket done in Google Classroom. I'll see you guys in class next time. Have a great rest of your